Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of this 3-part series. In the last podcast, we spent time talking about the players. Now, let's talk about their teams and how they're going to do. First, let's talk about the one conference that has done something that no other conference has been able to do in the last 6 seasons. Knock off the SEC in the title game. And that's right, we're going to talk about the ACC first.
Really quick, he says knock off the SEC. Florida State's in the exact same region as the SEC, so.
But they're not in the SEC, so I say yes, the SEC's dominance is done.
But they should be in the SEC. Anyway.
That's another conversation that we can have for another day. Let's start off first off in the Atlantic Division. This is how I feel that this will play out. Number 1 will be Florida State. Number 2 will be Clemson. Number 3, kind of the big surprise, and it seems like most of the experts agree. I'm not sure how big I am on it, but I'm willing to go with it just because I'm not really excited about anyone else in this division. But number 3 is Louisville. Number 4 is Syracuse. 5, NC State. 6, Boston College. And number 7 is Wake Forest. And then here is where my big surprise this year is going to come. In the Coastal Division, number 1, North Carolina. Will's already disagreeing with me. Will is already lacing up his boxing gloves, and we're ready to go toe to toe on this one. But number 2 is going to be Duke. I love what Coach Cutcliffe has done there at Duke, and I think Duke's just going to continue to just play at a really good high level there. Number 3, the Miami Hurricanes. I think they could get hot late in the year. They could have a type of year where they don't play well in the beginning, but they win some games just based on their talent alone, but then they become kind of like Michigan State at the end and just get red hot and possibly win the ACC. But for now, I have them at number 3. Number 4, Pittsburgh. I have a feeling Pittsburgh is going to be a much better team than what they were last year. And again, a lot of that just because it's a new conference. You're leaving the Big East and you're going to the ACC. You have to feel like there's going to be some growing pains with that. Number 5 is Virginia Tech. I know some people are really high on Virginia Tech. Unfortunately, I am not one of those people. I think Virginia Tech is going to struggle again this year. They may not even make a bowl game. That's just how far I think Virginia Tech could drop. And that has nothing to say on their head coach. Frank Beamer, world-class person. First ballot Hall of Famer in college. Okay, number 6, Georgia Tech. And number 7, Virginia. I feel terrible for Virginia. I wanted Mike London to be successful there. It's just simply not going to happen there for him. So I do think at the end of this year, we're going to have a new head coach there in Virginia. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do like Florida State to play North Carolina in the conference title. But here's the whole thing. I don't think Florida State goes undefeated. I think they lose a game late in the year that they're not supposed to. I know some people are going to be like, it'll be Clemson. I don't think Clemson beats them. I think Clemson makes that game very interesting, and I think it's going to be pretty competitive, a lot more competitive than what it was last year. I think it's going to be to someone else later on, but I love the North Carolina Tar Heels. I think this is their year. Florida State, I think they still make the playoffs, and I still think they win the ACC. So, Will, I know that you have your boxing gloves ready to go, and you are ready to go toe to toe with me on this. So, Will, go ahead.
Well, I don't even see any point in talking about the Coastal Division because when we're talking about the ACC, there's only 2 words that matter, and that's Florida State. Another 2 words that matter, Jameis Winston. How I'm looking at it, Florida State rolls through the ACC and their non-conference schedule, including Oklahoma State, to take the Atlantic Division, followed up by Clemson, Boston College, Wake Forest, North Carolina State, Louisville in the 6th slot, and then Syracuse all the way down at the 7. But, I mean, it's Florida State. They're going to win the division. And then going into the Coastal, when I was putting this together, I was like, who even cares? Whoever wins the division is going to get routed by Florida State in the championship game. But I've got Virginia Tech winning it. I've got Frank Beamer being the difference maker in a division that no one really cares about winning because they know it doesn't matter. Second, I've got Virginia. The reason I have Virginia, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to see one heck of a surprise from Virginia in a game that we don't expect to see them win. And so I've got them second, building off that game for momentum. I've got Georgia Tech third, Miami, Florida fourth, North Carolina fifth, Pittsburgh 6th. And yes, Duke will be last in that division. Last year was a fluke. Even though they came toe-to-toe with Texas A&M, it's over. They belong in the cellar. They can be good in basketball. Well, they lost to Mercer, but they can be good in basketball to a certain point. And then they belong in the cellar in football. It will return to that way this year. Florida State gets Virginia Tech in the championship game. Florida State goes in with a 12-0 record. They kill Virginia Tech, and they stay at the number one seed in the playoffs, number one in the polls the entire season.
I disagree with you on this because I just don't see it with Florida State. Florida State had a magical season last year, but my gut just tells me that Florida State is they're going to trip up. And I think that I don't know what game it's going to be, and I'm not going to pick that game, but I just feel that there is going to come a time when Florida State is going to get knocked off. Maybe it's when they travel to Louisville, because, we know that, hey, Bobby Petrino, he's back in Louisville. He may be a scumbag for how things went down in Arkansas, but is that going to affect him as a head coach? No. Has it ever affected him as a head coach? No. This guy knows how to win, and he is going to make Louisville a presence there.
The only two games I even see Florida State getting close in are against Oklahoma State and Notre Dame, but I still see those being about 10-point victories. The rest, Clemson included, they're just going to roll. All
right, so let's now move on to, I guess we can talk about the Southeastern Conference. I guess no preview show would be complete without talking about the Southeastern Conference. So this is how I have it breaking down. First in the East, and I think Will and I both agree on this, but number one, I have South Carolina. I think South Carolina does win this, and I'll kind of go a little more in depth with this one. Number two is going to be Florida. I think Florida has a big year this year. This is going to be a team that's going to play to keep Will Muschamp's job, because I think even a 7-5 record or even a 6-6 record, this guy's fired. And it's sad because Muschamp's a good coach. Number three is going to be Missouri. Number four will be Georgia. I'm not high on Georgia at all. I think Georgia could be the more overrated team in the SEC this year. If there's any more overrated team than Georgia in the Southeastern Conference, I would love to hear it. Number 5 will be Tennessee. Number 6 will be Kentucky. I think Kentucky takes some steps this year. I think they compete really hard, and I think they get really close to a 6-6 record, but they're just not quite there. Number 7, Vanderbilt. I think Vanderbilt is unfortunate, but no James Franklin. Back to the cellar with you guys. Out in the West, number 1, not going to be a surprise, but it's going to be Alabama. Number 2, Auburn. Number 3, Ole Miss. This is my big surprise this year. Ole Miss, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but Ole Miss gets both Alabama schools in Oxford. So they actually will have 2 chances to knock off both the teams from there. Number 4 will be LSU. LSU is young and inexperienced, and I think that will show up at times. I even think it could show up in that first game against Wisconsin early on. I think Wisconsin will make some plays that some other teams probably won't later on in the season. But this will be a team that they will be adjusting quite a bit on the fly with just the inexperience they have. Number 5, it's unfortunate, but Texas A&M. I like Texas A&M. I like Ken Sumlin, but I just think this is a team that I think is a program that does take a step back. I think Mississippi State, I think they have a better year this year. I think Mississippi State could be the surprise team this year. I know that Will's not high on Prescott. I actually am high on Prescott.
I'm not saying I'm not high on Prescott. I just don't think that he's going to deliver in the biggest games. But I think he's going to have a wonderful season.
And then number 7 is Arkansas. So this is how I feel the SEC will shake down, and then I'll let Will weigh in himself. Florida is going to be the most improved team this year. And Ole Miss, I know I just said Mississippi State could be the sleeper. I think Ole Miss is the sleeper. And I think they get off to a 4-0 start before they lose in double overtime to Alabama. But they get one back later in the year when they upset Auburn. Their first 4 games aren't that tough. They do play Boise State in the beginning, but again, Boise State they're not the same program that they once were. And plus they have a new coach. But I think that they start the year off 4-0 before they lose in double overtime to Alabama. But they do get one back later in the year when they upset Auburn, preventing Auburn from meeting Alabama in a potential undefeated clash. I think Florida gets off to a 3-0 start before losing to Alabama. But then you look at after that, their schedule is a little bit tougher. I think they pull off a string of 5 straight victories upsetting both Missouri and LSU, who they play in the Swamp. Plus, I do think that they will pull away late against a really good Georgia team. But I think, unfortunately, what it does end up happening, and I think it sets up a clash with South Carolina at home. That's the whole thing is South Carolina has to go to Florida. Obviously, Florida's going to be favored in that game a little bit. But I like South Carolina, which sends the Gamecocks to play Atlanta, where, unfortunately, they're going to get Roll Tide by Alabama, sending Alabama to the playoffs. So, Will, I'll let you now go ahead and let you preview what your SEC is going to look like this year.
Okay, first off, I'm going to start off by saying we are going to have a team, just like Florida State does in the ACC, we're going to have a team go undefeated until the conference championship game. They'll be 12-0 going into that game, but then they are going to lose that game. I'll get into that later. In the East, I've got South Carolina, the Gamecocks, as the number one there in the East. I think they're the best team. I've got Georgia second, just because Georgia's always going to compete. Missouri third, taking a step back. The Florida Gators fourth. Vanderbilt fifth. Kentucky sixth. I've got Tennessee coming in last. I just see that organization is crumbling to the ground, and I think we're going to see that this year. They're in the West. Then in the West, I've got Alabama on top. They're the best. They are the unheralded, and there's no way that they're going to let Auburn beat them again this year. Second, I've got Auburn. They are the second best team there. They're almost as good as Alabama, but not quite. Third, I've got Mississippi State. I think they're going to be good. I think Prescott's going to blow the big games, which will be the difference between winning the division and getting third in the division. Then fourth, I've got a surprise. I've got Arkansas coming in fourth. And the only reason they're coming in fourth is because they're going to have Alabama, Auburn, and Mississippi State ahead of them. That's the only reason. Then rounding out the last three, I've got LSU coming in fifth, Texas A&M coming in sixth, and then the Ole Miss Rebels coming in seventh. Not because they're not talented, but because they are in the SEC West. And how I see all of this working out, first off, South Carolina is the team that I have going undefeated in the regular season. I don't see a game that I see them losing. I see close games, close calls, but I think that they can run the table. They can go 12-0, and there's going to be talk on whether they are the new king of the SEC. Of course, then we'll get to the SEC championship game, which you've already heard me say they're going to lose that one, obviously to Alabama, since I predicted them to go there. But I've got Alabama actually losing a game during the regular season. I think Arkansas can upset Alabama in the regular season, and I think that's what's going to happen there. Auburn, I see them losing a couple of games, obviously to South Carolina, and then they're going to lose to Alabama as well. It's just, those are games that both South Carolina and Alabama are going to want those games this year, and they're going to win both of them. Then, just continuing on with that, I've got Georgia. I think that they're going to lose about 3 games. I think they could lose to South Carolina. I think they could lose to Auburn. I think they could lose to an Arkansas team. And I just see that happening. Mississippi State, I think, is only really going to lose a couple of games. I do have them below Georgia, but they're definitely going to lose to Auburn and Alabama. There's probably going to be another one in there, too, that they're going to have to lose. And then Arkansas, the reason I'm touting them so much is it's a turnaround for them. I see them losing about 4 games. I see them losing to Auburn. I see them losing to Mississippi State. I see them losing to Missouri. And then I think, I'm not high on the Aggies this year, but I think Texas A&M can go in there and beat them as well. And then lastly, Missouri. I see Missouri losing to teams like South Carolina and Georgia, but Missouri's a team, and we'll talk about this later, but I see them blowing a huge game, and it's an upset that we're going to talk about at a later time. But then going into the SEC championship game, Alabama versus South Carolina, what people will be saying, the old king versus the new king, and it's proven that old is always better. Alabama beats them handily and punches a ticket to go to the playoffs.
Alrighty, so we'll move right along, and now we're going to go to at least my neck of the woods, and we're going to go talk about the Big Ten Conference. So we'll first start off with the East. Number 1, I have Michigan State. I'm not still very high on Michigan State, but I do think because they will get Ohio State at home, I think that will play a major factor for this team. Plus, with their trip to Oregon, I'll talk about that here in a second. But number 2 I have in the East is Ohio State, followed by Michigan. And I think followed by one team that's going to surprise some people. Number 4 is Indiana. I like the Hoosiers. And you look at for Kevin Wilson, this is a big year this year for him. There are a lot of people that are putting him on the hot seat. Now, granted, he does coach at Indiana. So any coach that coaches there is most likely going to be on the hot seat. Good basketball school, just not a good football school. Number 5, I think, will be Penn State. James Franklin, I think he's just going to do wonders for Christian Hackenberg. I think by the end of this year, I think if there's another quarterback out there that people are going to get to know very well, I think it's going to be Hackenberg, because not only does Ohio State have to go to Michigan State, but they have to go play at Penn State as well. And with that, you look at that schedule, you look at them, Christian Hackenberg could have a coming out party for them. Number 6 and number 7, respectively, will be Maryland and Rutgers. Sorry, guys. Welcome to Big Ten football. It's going to be a rocky first season for you guys. Number 1 out in the West, and I'll talk about this. Number 1 I have is Nebraska. Number 2, Wisconsin. Number 3, Iowa. Number 4, Northwestern, who I think does have a bounce back year. I mean, anytime I've ever discounted Pat Fitzgerald, he's come through. Number 5, I think, is Minnesota. And I don't think Minnesota is going to be a bad team. I think Minnesota is going to be a really good team. It's just the whole fact that they're playing in the West and they have to play Nebraska and Wisconsin and Iowa. And I don't foresee them winning any of those 3 games. Number 6 will be Illinois. Sorry, guys, but it's unfortunate. And then number 7 will be Purdue. Okay, here is my breakdown for the Big Ten Conference. And I know Will is just licking his chops right now. Just get in on this one. Okay. Granted, I'll be the first one to admit that Nebraska, number 1 in the West, is a homer pick. But I do love this team. Their road to Indy will not be easy. With road trips this year traveling to Fresno State in the 3rd week of the season, Michigan State, Northwestern, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Wisconsin and Iowa will be the last 2 of the last 3 games. And we remember the last time Nebraska played Wisconsin and the last time Nebraska played Iowa, they weren't pretty. Playing these sort of road games would make a lot of teams shiver, but I don't see that happening with this team. And I think for the first time in the Bo Pelini era, they go 11-1. And I'll talk a little bit about where that loss comes from. I believe they get off to a really good undefeated start, meaning that they do beat Miami, which, again, I'm pretty high on, and I think Miami's going to be a very good team this year. So I think they get off to an undefeated start before they lose in a last-second field goal on the road to Michigan State. However, they get that one back by beating both Wisconsin and Iowa to close out the year to win the West. Michigan State will trip up early with their trip to Eugene and lose by 3 touchdowns, all coming in the 4th quarter to the Ducks. I just look at the speed of Oregon, and I just think after a while, the speed is just going to really start eating up that defense for Michigan State. And it's not because Michigan State won't be able to keep up with them. I just don't think that they necessarily have the same speed that Oregon has, and I just don't think that they can play the same high level that Oregon loves to play when they play in Alton Stadium. But then if you look at the rest of the schedule, there's really not much there for Michigan State. Pulling off a string of 6 straight victories, which is pretty much what will happen before an undefeated Ohio State team comes to town. And this will be dubbed as the biggest game in the Big Ten Conference, just simply because it will be an undefeated Ohio State team and a 1-loss Michigan State team. And I think this game is just going to be an absolute instant classic for all of us to watch. I think you're going to watch this game when it happens. So, in what will be the biggest game in the Big Ten this year, I like the Spartans to win an instant classic, winning in 4 overtimes, propelling them to the top, setting up a rematch in the Big Ten title game between the Huskers and Sparty. So this will actually make it kind of an interesting thing, because I think Ohio State will be pretty high up in the rankings. So it'll drop them a little bit, but Michigan State should be pretty high as well. So I don't think that the pollsters will hurt Ohio State too much with that. So I think Ohio State will be on the outside looking in, and will need the Huskers to pull off an impossible upset by beating the Red Hot Spartan team to get in the playoffs. Well, I think this year their wish will be granted, as the Huskers, behind Amir Abdullah's 22 carries for 210 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns, the Huskers will win their first conference title since 1998, which will send the Buckeyes to the playoffs and the Huskers to the Fiesta Bowl and the Spartans to the Chick-fil-A Bowl in Atlanta. So that's how I see the Big Ten playing out. Will, go to town.
While Craig was talking, I pulled up the definition of homer online, and I would like to read that to everybody. It is a sports fan who picks his or her team to win despite very objective evidence to the contrary. I'm not saying Nebraska's going to be a bad team this year. They're going to be good. They're Nebraska. They have a good coach. They're not winning the Big Ten. And here, I'm just going to go down my quick list. In the East, I've got the Ohio State Buckeyes winning that division. I've got Penn State actually coming in second. I think Christian Hackenberg is going to have a great year. The only reason Penn State's not going to be in contention for the Big Ten title is obviously because of the sanctions against them. Third will be Michigan State, which a couple days ago you would have asked me if I thought Michigan State won that division. It would have been yes, in a heartbeat. But Michigan State, I just feel... we'll get into that later. I got a couple of huge shocks in Michigan State's schedule that Craig is going to be laughing at me. I know he will be. But I think that they end up third. We got Rutgers coming in fourth. I think they have a solid first year in the Big Ten. Michigan fifth. We're kind of forgetting about them, and I think that we are going to forget. 6 Indiana, and then 7 Maryland. Indiana and Maryland, they're going to be battling for the worst record. Whoever wins that game between the two of them, yeah, you know. And then in the West, I've got Wisconsin coming in first. They've got the best player in the Big Ten, who is Melvin Gordon, not Amir Abdullah, and that'll be the difference maker. I've got Nebraska coming in second, Iowa third, Northwestern fourth, Minnesota fifth, Illinois sixth, Purdue seven. I'm just going to go through those because no one cares about anybody after Wisconsin and Nebraska. Here's how I see things shaking out. Ohio State's going to have a couple of losses during the regular season. They're not going to go through unblemished. They're going to lose to Penn State for sure. And they could also potentially lose that game to Michigan State. I do think that they're going to win the division, though, so they'll probably actually beat Michigan State for the tiebreaker. But I think that Ohio State definitely loses to Penn State. Going on with that, I think Penn State, their only losses are probably going to come to Michigan State. I see them losing to UCF again in that game that they lost last year. And then I also see them losing to Rutgers. The reason being, they are Rutgers' first game in the Big Ten, and I see Rutgers going in there and wanting to make a statement in the Big Ten. That statement will disappear later on in the season, but Rutgers beats Penn State, and those will be their 3 losses. Then on the other side, I've got Wisconsin and Nebraska, and the championship, the division battle is going to be between the two of those. Here's the thing. I think Nebraska beats Wisconsin, but I think Wisconsin will still win the division. I think the only loss that Wisconsin has all year is to Nebraska leading up to the Big Ten championship game. So therefore, Nebraska's only going to have to lose 2 games, which I think they will. I have them going 10-2. I have them losing to Michigan State and then somebody else. I want to put that loss as Miami. I think Miami can actually beat Nebraska this year. I think Nebraska can win the majority of their other games, but I still do think that Wisconsin's going to win that division. Setting up Wisconsin and Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, in which I just think Ohio State's the better team. Overall, they've got the better coach, they've got better players, they got a better quarterback, and then we'll have Ohio State winning the Big Ten, but not advancing to the playoffs.
Well, obviously, you and I both will have to disagree on that, but we'll move right along now, and I think we'll talk about our last 2 conferences before we'll end this one. First up will be the Big 12. I really like the Big 12 this year. I think the Big 12 is going to be a very underrated football conference this year. I think the Big 12 will not get the type of press that they probably should deserve. But here's how I look at it. I'm going to take Oklahoma number 1. I just think the momentum they built off of that Sugar Bowl win will carry a Bob Stoops team. Number 2 will be Baylor. Number 3 is my surprise team in Kansas State. Really love this team. Number 4 will be Oklahoma State. Number 5 will be Texas. Sorry, Longhorn fans. Not really. Number 6 will be TCU. 7, Texas Tech. 8, Iowa State. 9, West Virginia. And last of all, Kansas will be number 10. The Big 12 will be an interesting conference this year, and the race will go down the line to the finish just like it did last year. In my last podcast, I told you guys to watch out for Jake Waters and Tyler Lockett, and this year they will show you why. Their first 2 games, no one's going to really be talking about Kansas State at all. It's their 3rd game where people are really going to start talking about Kansas State. Why? Because they get the Auburn Tigers to come to Manhattan. It's going to be a huge game. I mean, this is probably the biggest non-conference home game that they have had since USC came in several years ago and Kansas State beat them. So with that, this is going to be a huge game. Jake Waters and Tyler Lockett will impress in a losing effort. Waters will end up throwing for 300 yards and have about 3 touchdowns. 2 of them will come to Lockett. But thanks to some late turnovers late in the game, I think Auburn escapes with a 31-30 victory. I think this is going to be a very high-scoring game, just simply because Auburn is going to be in a very different territory that they're just simply not used to. You know, playing in Manhattan and playing at Kansas State, it's just something that I don't think Auburn is prepared for. I don't think as much work as Gus Malzahn will put in for that team, will put in that week. I just don't think that team will be prepared. And I think it'll take a few quarters for them to realize we need to start playing better. Otherwise, Kansas State's going to beat us. I think after that, everyone is going to know who Jake Waters is and is going to know who Kansas State is. So after that, they will be about 1-4 heading into Oklahoma game, where they'll lose another heartbreaker 38-28. Yes, it's a 10-point loss, but what's the difference between a 10-point victory and a 9-point victory? Just saying. So I think that will be a heartbreaker, and that will I think that'll be Oklahoma's last major threat for their chance to win the Big 12. Maybe other than Baylor and also Texas, their annual game there in the Cotton Bowl is. But after that, Kansas State gets both Oklahoma State and Texas in Manhattan. And I think that is where the tiebreaker comes in. That's where I see Kansas State winning and basically being the third best team in the Big 12 next year. However, at the end of the day, Oklahoma and their pretty much light schedule, they really don't play anybody. There's really no one on their schedule that, other than their conference schedule, that's just going to strike fear into the hearts of into Sooner fans. So I think because of that, Oklahoma does win this conference. And to be honest with you, you look at their schedule, there should be really no reason for this team not to be at the end of the year undefeated. They get both Baylor and Oklahoma State at home. Plus, I think they win a blowout over Texas to help them win the conference. Okay, Will, go ahead and tell the good listeners what you see as happening in the Big 12.
Well, I have to agree 100% that Oklahoma is going to be the best team in the Big 12. They're going to win the conference. They're going to come out first. Second is going to be Baylor. And then we just switched on our thirds and fourth, Craig. I have Oklahoma State third, Kansas State fourth. Kansas State is going to be an excellent team this year. After that, the rest of the conferences go as follows. TCU is going to come in fifth. West Virginia will be sixth. I've got Texas at 7. The strong years are not going to start out very strong there in Texas, and there's going to be a lot of people already clamoring for his job this year as a head coach. Then I've got Iowa State, Texas Tech taking a huge step backwards and coming in 9th, and then lastly the Kansas Jayhawks, because we all know they're going to be 10th. I, however, don't agree with you, Craig. I think that Oklahoma will lose one game during the year. I want to say it's going to be the Baylor game. I really do, but the problem with that is I think Baylor's only going to lose one game too. So I see Oklahoma maybe losing to a Kansas State and just blowing one game against a team, but just not really producing that way in that game and losing one, but winning the rest of their games. I think Baylor loses one game, probably to Oklahoma, although I'd say Kansas State is another potential upset there. Then I've got Oklahoma State. They're probably going to lose about 3 games. They're going to lose their opener against Florida State. It's going to happen, even though they're going to try their hardest. And then they're going to lose to Baylor and Oklahoma. So, I say 9-3. It sounds bad. Really, your 3 losses come to Florida State, Baylor, and Oklahoma. I have all of them in the playoffs. Oklahoma State just suffers from a bad schedule. And then Kansas State, I think they'll be 8-4. They're going to lose that Auburn game, although I think they're going to fight for it. They'll lose to Oklahoma State. They'll lose to Oklahoma. And maybe throw in a team like Texas Tech there too. A team that really doesn't do well in the conference, but can still beat Kansas State in a shootout or a gritty game or just a close game. I think Kansas State goes 8-4. But all in all, Oklahoma wins the conference. But both Oklahoma and Baylor take my final 2 slots in the playoffs.
Now, well, we're going to turn to your neck of the woods. We're going to talk about the Pac-12. And I think, again, the Pac-12 is probably one of the more deeper conferences in college football this year. There are at least, I think, maybe 4 or 5 teams that could end up winning this conference, that could get hot and win this conference. And it's not just the Ducks. But here's how I have the Pac-12 ending up this year. First off, the North. I like the Oregon Ducks. I think they finally reversed their little curse, if you will, against Stanford. I think they finally beat them, making pretty much putting Stanford at 2nd. Number 3, I like Oregon State. I think because of Mannion, and I think of his ability to make plays with his arm, he's going to have to make plays. There's no doubt about that. If he has a bad game, Oregon State's going to have a bad day. It's not going to be pretty. So he has to play at a very high level all year round. And I think he does that. And I think he gets Oregon State pretty close. But again, they're just not good enough to beat Stanford or Oregon. Number 4, I like Washington State. I love the fact that this team went 6-6 last year. Could have and should have won their bowl game, but I like this team. I like Mike Leach. He knows how to coach. He knows how to get these programs turned around. So I see them going 8-4. I see Washington State surprising some people and then playing very tough against some pretty good opponents. Washington, new head coach, Chris Peterson being there. I think Washington's competitive, but I think it's going to take a few years. Give it some time there, Husky fans. Give Peterson some time to recruit, and I think you'll see Washington competing for the top spot maybe the next 3 or 4 years. And then lastly, Cal. I think Cal is going to be a lot tougher of a team. It's just they're playing in the North, and someone has to come last. So I think it ends up being Cal. Down in the South, I like UCLA. I think UCLA has one of the best seasons in the history of Bruin football. I think fans are going to be talking about this season for years to come. Number 2 is Arizona State. Number 3, I think, is USC. USC has a lot harder schedule, but I think Sarkisian, I think he'll put a fire under this program, and I think late in the year they'll make kind of a push, and that's where they'll end up third. Number 4, I got Arizona. I think Arizona, again, making steps with Rich Rodriguez, but they're not there yet. Number 5, I have Utah, and number 6, I have Colorado. Okay, so this is how I break down the Pac-12. The Pac-12 will be exciting this year, not just because they could get 2 teams into the playoffs this year. They very well easily could. I mean, Oregon and Stanford very easily could wind up in the playoffs, even UCLA. You could see Oregon and UCLA just depending on how the season breaks down. I know that the Ducks in the past, and I know will address this, I know that the Ducks in the past, they have had the history of disappointing people. I know that there have just been simply games.
And I laugh so hard every single time because they freak out in my hometown.
So if you don't know, Will is actually from Eugene, so that's
Springfield, thank you very much.
Okay, whatever. Same thing. But nonetheless, I don't think that happens this year. I think finally Oregon, and I think Mariota, I think he's going to take control of this team. I think he's going to be the reason why the Ducks go undefeated this year. One other thing to just keep in mind that while, yes, the Ducks have disappointed, however, they will have a few scares along the way, which I think will actually help this team down the stretch. They do have to go to UCLA, they have to go to Washington State, and they have to go play at Oregon State in the Civil War. But I do like them ending their curse against Stanford, because Stanford does have to come to Oregon, so they do have to come to Alton Stadium. And I think Oregon finally does reverse that and win this conference. However, there could be one potential trap game that I'm going to just throw out, and that game could come the next week after they play Stanford. They have to travel to Utah and have to play the Utes on the road. I mean, on paper, it should look like no problem. The Utes won't even stand a chance. But we could be talking about a game where Kyle Whittingham's job is on the line. If he wins that game, there's a great chance that he keeps his job. But if he loses that game, most likely he's out. He's done. However, I do think the one team that will put maybe the biggest scare in them, and I think will agree with me, is the UCLA Bruins. I think the UCLA Bruins, they lose only 2 games this whole year. Both of those losses are going to be to the Ducks. I love this UCLA team. I love Brett Hundley, and I think he's going to be in some serious talk for Heisman votes. Like I said before, I think USC does do enough. I think they go 8-4. They finish the year off number 3. I really like ASU and their quarterback, Taylor Kelly. He will take major steps this year. One thing for them is that they get UCLA, Stanford, and they get a home game against Notre Dame. And I think Taylor Kelly has a huge day against Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame comes into that game maybe with a 1 or 2 losses and a possible outside chance of making it into the playoffs just because they're Notre Dame. They come into this game, which is late in the year, and so they have to travel out to the desert to play Arizona State. I think Taylor Kelly puts a magical game together and just upsets the Irish, pretty much ending any chance or any hope that Notre Dame could possibly have of making it to the playoffs. I do like them losing close games to UCLA and Stanford, but like I said, I feel like they do pull a huge win against the Irish late in the year. I like this team to go 9-3, but just not enough to get them over the hump. Okay, Will, real quickly, I'll give you the opportunity now to give us your preview for the Pac-12.
Perfect. I'd like to preface this by saying that I am not an Oregon Ducks fan in any means. Not because I don't like the team, but, and I hope you're all listening, the fans, they're crazy. I could go on. Anyway, in the Pac-12 North, I've got the Ducks winning it all. They're the best team in that division, and they're going to win it. Second, this is going to come as a surprise to some. I've actually got the Oregon State Beavers, and it might be a little bit too much for me to think they go there. I don't think they are a number 2 team, but I think that's where they're going to end up based on how the other teams are. Third, I've got the Stanford Cardinal. I think that they're really going to take a step back this year, and we're not going to see the same talent out of them that we have, and it's going to be confusing to a lot of people. Fourth, I've got California. I think Sonny Dykes can keep them above the Washington schools. And then ending up, I've got Washington and then Washington State in the cellar. Moving on to the South Division, I too also have the UCLA Bruins winning the South Division. I have them going undefeated in Pac-12 play. However, I don't think they're going to go undefeated. We'll get into that in our next podcast. Got USC coming in second, Utah coming in third, Arizona and Arizona State fourth and fifth, and then Colorado in the cellar there. How I see things working out, like I said, UCLA is not going to go undefeated. I'm not going to say where I think their losses are going to be. We'll talk about that in the next podcast. But they're going to win the Pac-12 championship in total. I see them going into that game with Oregon, already having beaten Oregon once, and then beating them again in the Pac-12 championship to take the Pac-12 championship for themselves. However, I don't see them making the playoffs because of the 2 losses I'm going to talk about later on. Oregon Ducks, I see them only losing 2 games all year, both to UCLA. So the complete opposite of what Craig said. I see them losing both of their games to UCLA, sending them reeling. They'll probably get a selection committee bowl game. They'll probably finish in the top 10, but they're not going to make the playoffs like a lot of people are saying. Also, USC, I see them as a 10-win team this year. I see them going 10-2. Their losses, UCLA and Oregon State. They never play well up in Corvallis, and the Beavers always play USC very well, whether it's in USC or in Oregon State. Luckily, they don't have to play the Ducks, so they get their 10-win season. And lastly, I've got the Oregon State Beavers. I think the Beavers are going to be an excellent team this next year. They have an easier schedule. They're going to lose to Oregon. As much as I would love to see them beat Oregon, it's not going to happen. But I feel like they're going to lose a couple other games in there too. The San Diego State game for them, I feel like that could be a big trap game for them. And also, I think that they're going to blow another smaller game, maybe against the Sonny Dykes California team that they have to play. Anyway, that's kind of how I see the Pac-12 shaking out. UCLA winning the Pac-12 championship. Oregon's only 2 losses coming to those Bruins. Brett Hundley proving he is better than Marcus Mariota.
Again, I don't think that's terribly hard for Hundley to be able to do that. I think his stats are going to speak for themselves, but I think Mariota will still end up being the top quarterback, even though he won't necessarily be the best quarterback in that conference. All right, folks, that does do it about for part 2 of this podcast. The last part is coming up, and I guarantee you there are going to be some fireworks, and I guarantee you there are going to probably be some of you that are going to be yelling at us. If you haven't already, then I feel like I failed. If you aren't yelling at me right now through your speakers, then I feel like I failed you. So anyways, so that about does it for part 2. Up next will be part 3.